Hey guys, today we're diving headfirst into the windswept grasslands of Central Asia, where your cozy Netflix sofa is swapped for a felt saddle and your delivery apps are replaced with whatever you can chase down with a bow. You're born into the Mongol steppe, a world so wide and flat you can watch your dog run away for 3 days. Life here doesn't come with tutorial levels. You're thrown into the survival game on expert mode. And just so you know, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. You grow up where winters bite harder than wolves and summers fry the grass to tinder. Forget about cozy villages or bustling markets. This is a land with no walls, no castles, no safety nets. Everything you need to survive comes from your herd. Horses, sheep, goats, camels. Milk is your drink, meat is your feast, and hides are your shelter. From day one, you learn that comfort is an illusion. Babies are swaddled in felt. Children ride before they walk properly. And you? Well, you're expected to shoot an arrow before you can write your name, which, let's be honest, most people never even learn to do anyway. And it's not just about the animals. The land itself is both your playground and your jailer. Rivers freeze so solid you can drag sledges across them, but then thaw and swallow entire camps when the ice breaks. Dust storms whip across plains, turning your world into a stinging blur. If you're unlucky, you wake up to wolves circling the herd at night, eyes gleaming like tiny campfires. If you're really unlucky, it's not wolves but rival clans sneaking up for a raid. Here's the mainstream fact. Mongol children really were trained from an insanely early age in horseback riding, archery, and survival. Archaeologists digging through burials often find child skeletons with tiny bows and quivers laid beside them. That's like giving a 6-year-old today a credit card and saying, "Good luck paying rent." But there's also a quirky tidbit. One of the popular snacks of the steppe was dried curd called arrowel. This rock-hard dairy brick could last for years without spoiling. Imagine chewing on something so tough you might lose a tooth. But hey, portable protein is portable protein. Soldiers often carried sacks of it on campaign, gnawing like squirrels between battles. Historians still argue whether this humble snack gave the Mongols an edge in endurance compared to grain-fed armies in Europe. It's basically the steppe version of energy bars. Of course, your biggest teacher is hardship. Raids and famines aren't if, they're when. As a kid, you might lose your father to ambush, your herd to disease, or your tent to a rival tribe's midnight visit. What doesn't kill you makes you cautious, and what makes you cautious makes you clever. By the time you're a teenager, you've learned to read the wind, track animals, and size up strangers with one glance. Trust is scarce, but loyalty? That's worth more than gold. Think about it. No permanent houses, no farms, no libraries. And yet, somehow, out of this harsh emptiness comes an empire that will stretch farther than Rome ever dreamed. That's the paradox you're standing in right now. Frozen toes in the grass, eyes scanning the horizon, bowstring humming like a guitar string about to snap. The steppe is shaping you, chiseling you, even though you don't realize it yet. Every empty mile of horizon is training your patience. Every howl of wind, your endurance. Every desperate winter, your ingenuity. And in the silence of this vast plain, an empire is already whispering its first breath. You've barely learned to balance on your own legs before someone plops you on a shaggy little steppe pony and gives the reins a flick. Forget tricycles or training wheels. You're expected to cling on and figure out before gravity does its worst. And somehow you do. By the age of 3 or 4, you're riding like it's second nature. These aren't just horses. They're the engines of Mongol life. The 4-legged Wi-Fi routers that connect the steppe. Now, here's the thing. Mongol ponies aren't glamorous stallions from a medieval tapestry. They're short, chunky, and about as graceful as a barrel on legs. But don't be fooled. These little tanks can gallop for hours, survive on frozen grass, and still carry you across 1,000 miles without collapsing. They're basically the Toyota Hilux of the animal kingdom. Not pretty, but good luck trying to kill one. Your entire world is measured in hoofbeats. Horses are your transport, your shield, your dinner, and occasionally your pillow if you've had a long night. In a fight, you don't walk into battle. You ride in with a quiver full of arrows and a spare horse tethered to your side. A Mongol warrior typically kept 3 or 4 mounts, switching them out mid-battle like some kind of equestrian pit stop. Cavalry units in Europe just couldn't compete with that endurance. Mainstream historians agree. Mobility was the Mongols' superweapon. Here's a fun tidbit. If your horse ran out of steam and no backup was around, you might prick its neck and drink a little warm blood. Not enough to kill it, just a survival shot of iron and protein. Think of it as the Mongol version of an energy drink. Red Bull gives you wings. Mongol ponies give you more Mongol ponies. And it wasn't just endurance. Mongol riders invented tricks that sound like circus acts. You could lean sideways until your whole body was hidden by the horse's ribs, arrows whistling past where your chest used to be. Or you could hang upside down to shoot from under the horse's neck, just to really confuse the poor guy trying to kill you. Historians still argue whether these stunts were common practice or just flashy exceptions. But the fact they were even possible tells you something about the bond between rider and mount. That bond was forged early. You're brushing, feeding, and sleeping near your horse from childhood. Horses weren't pets, though. You'd happily butcher one if you needed meat. But in battle, you treated them like brothers in arms. A single rider with 4 fresh mounts could travel up to 100 miles in a single day. Imagine outpacing every medieval messenger on the planet. That's how Mongol scouts ran circles around their enemies. And let's not forget the soundtrack of your childhood. The constant snorting, stomping, and whinnying of herds. The air smells of leather and sweat, mixed with the sour tang of fermented mare's milk. Yes, arag, the Mongol national drink. It's like yogurt and champagne had a very confused baby. Drink enough and you'll swear you can ride without a saddle. It all adds up to this. In a world where other civilizations built walls and cities to keep invaders out, you're building speed and stamina to make walls irrelevant. You don't just cross distances, you erase them. Your horse is your weapon, your passport, and your escape plan. Without them, you're just a cold nomad with bad aim. With them, you're the future nightmare of every settled empire. The grasslands roll on forever, but mounted on your pony, forever doesn't feel so big. In fact, forever feels like something you might actually conquer. Step inside your home, or rather, duck inside because the doorway is barely tall enough for you to stand upright. It's round, smells faintly of smoke and milk, and creaks a little in the wind. Congratulations, you're in a gur, also known as a yurt, the felt-wrapped spaceship of the steppe. Forget marble palaces. Your walls are made of wool and horsehair. But here's the trick. You can pack the whole thing on a couple of carts and move it before your neighbors even notice you've gone. Try doing that with a castle. Inside, the space is both humble and ingenious. The fire pit burns in the center, smoke sneaking out through a hole in the roof. Around the edges lie beds, blankets, tools, and the occasional weapon propped up casually like an umbrella by the door. If you're a child, you probably get scolded for touching the saddle stand. It's sacred, a reminder that horses are practically divine here. Everything has its place, and chaos is not tolerated, even if the whole house is made of wool. Now, what about the food? Let's just say the Mongol diet doesn't come from a trendy cookbook. You drink fermented mare's milk called arag. Yes, still bubbly, and yes, still weird. You chew on dried curd that could double as a building material. Meat? Lots of it. Sheep, goat, horse if you're desperate. But here's the kicker. The Mongols accidentally stumbled into one of the most efficient military diets in history. Animal protein and fat are calorie-dense, portable, and perfect for surviving long campaigns. Modern nutritionists might balk at the cholesterol, but your arteries don't get a vote out here. Mainstream historians note that this meat and dairy-heavy diet gave Mongol warriors stamina that grain-fed peasants couldn't match. But here's a quirky tidbit. When the herds were thin, people boiled animal bones repeatedly until every drop of marrow was leached out. You get a cloudy broth that was, let's call it, minimally nourishing. Not quite ramen night, but it kept you alive. Historians still argue whether this extreme frugality was a sign of constant hardship or simply clever resource management. And let's not skip the social fuel, hospitality. Steppe etiquette demands that if someone wanders into your tent, you offer them food, drink, and a seat. Doesn't matter if they're friend, enemy, or some random traitor lost in the grass. You serve them first, argue later. Your gur is a portable embassy, your stew pot a diplomatic tool. The trick is you never know which guest might one day command an army of 10,000 horsemen. Daily life has its rhythms: tending herds, repairing saddles, milking mares, moving camp when pastures run out. You grow up with chores, but also with freedom. The steppe is your playground, and your closest siblings are the animals. You learn to whistle commands that your horse actually obeys better than your younger brother. The quirky humor of it all? Well, imagine explaining to a medieval French knight that your army runs on milk. He's armored in steel, dining on bread and wine, while you're charging at him powered by sour dairy. Yet history will prove which fuel tank lasts longer. As you sit by the central fire, smoke stinging your eyes, you probably don't feel like you're building the foundation of an empire. But every sip of air rag, every ride across the open plain, every hour of wind rattling your felt walls, it all trains you for something bigger. It makes you mobile, self-sufficient, and weirdly unstoppable. The yurts may be fragile, but the people inside them, not so much. The problem with steppe life is simple. Everyone wants your stuff, and you probably want theirs. Herds are wealth, and wealth is always tempting, so raids are the neighborhood pastime. You and your clan live in a cycle of alliances, betrayals, and the occasional midnight stampede when somebody decides to borrow your horses permanently. Forget small-town gossip. Here, the drama involves flaming arrows and screaming warriors. Growing up, you learn fast that loyalty is slippery. One week your tribe swears brotherhood with another. The next week, someone insults someone else's ancestor, and suddenly everyone is sharpening spears. It sounds chaotic, but weirdly, this turbulence teaches the most important Mongol skill: flexibility. You get used to shifting loyalties, negotiating truces, and, when that fails, riding like your hair's on fire to avoid being wiped out. Mainstream historians agree that this fractious environment hardened the Mongols into battle-ready survivors. If you can survive constant backstabbing at home, facing foreign empires doesn't feel so impossible. But here's the quirky tidbit. One of the favorite tricks in these local squabbles was the fake retreat. Picture it. You're in a skirmish, the other side charges, and your people suddenly bolt in apparent panic. The enemy chases, thinking victory is theirs, only to be lured into an ambush. It's playground tag, on horseback, except the losers don't go home crying. They go home minus a herd. Historians still argue whether this tactic was a product of desperation or if it became a kind of cultural signature passed down until it terrified whole kingdoms. This tribal turbulence also meant leadership was constantly tested. A Khan who failed to protect the herds or distribute loot fairly could be tossed aside faster than you can say new management. You learn that charisma is as valuable as arrows. A leader has to be generous but not weak, ruthless but not reckless. Steppe politics is a balancing act performed on horseback, with wolves circling below. And while men are riding into battle, women are holding the whole show together. When the warriors leave, the herds still need care, the yurts still need moving, and disputes still need settling. Your mother, sisters, and grandmothers become the backbone of daily survival. Later, this experience of shared responsibility will help Mongol society absorb losses in battle without crumbling. Clan feuds may erupt, but the home front never really collapses. For you personally, all this feuding is just background noise until it hits close. Maybe your father is killed in a raid, leaving your family vulnerable. Maybe you're left destitute, wandering the steppe with only a few animals and your wits. That kind of loss sears deep, and it shapes entire generations. Out of this crucible comes a certain boy named Temujin, later called Genghis Khan, whose early years of betrayal and exile will become legend. But for now, to you, he's just another reminder that the steppe makes orphans as quickly as it makes warriors. So, you grow up suspicious but also adaptable. You learn to read people the way others read books, spotting a lie in a smile, weighing whether an oath is worth the breath it cost. You also learn the odd humor of it all, like how your fiercest enemies today might be your in-laws tomorrow. Steppe politics, part survival, part soap opera, all on horseback. And yet, out of this chaos, something extraordinary is brewing. All those betrayals, skirmishes, and uneasy alliances are teaching your people how to unite when the stakes are high enough. You don't know it yet, but the very fractures that keep your tribe on edge are also forging the skills needed to weld dozens of clans into one unstoppable empire. Somewhere on the horizon of this chaotic steppe world, a boy named Temujin is born into one of these endlessly feuding clans. His father, a tribal chieftain, gives him a respectable start, but fate doesn't exactly deal him a winning hand. When Temujin is about 9, his father is poisoned by rivals, and suddenly the family is abandoned, stripped of status, left to scrape together a living with little more than a few bones to boil. You think your childhood was tough? Try scavenging roots and rodents in a landscape where even the grass looks hungry. This is the kind of background that either breaks you or forges you into something terrifyingly resilient. Temujin grows up in the shadow of betrayal. Relatives who once swore loyalty vanish. Friends conveniently forget they ever knew him. He learns that survival means trusting no one completely and keeping your options open. Historians still argue whether these formative hardships explain his later ruthlessness or if he was simply born with the kind of personality that refuses to stay down. Either way, his early life sets the tone. You win loyalty not with birthright, but with proof of strength. They're the mainstream fact here. Temujin didn't rise because he had the biggest tribe. He rose because he redefined what leadership meant. Instead of relying solely on blood ties, he promoted men based on talent and loyalty. That's revolutionary in a society where my cousin gets the best horse is basically law. For the first time, a shepherd with skill could rise above a noble who couldn't hit a barn with an arrow. Meritocracy, steppe style. And let's add a quirky tidbit. During his rise, Temujin was captured by enemies and enslaved for a while, wearing a wooden collar to mark his humiliation. He escaped, supposedly with the help of a sympathetic guard, and later rewarded that man when he came to power. Imagine being the one guy who let Genghis Khan slip away and then living long enough for him to send you a thanks bro fruit basket of herds and titles. Temujin's real genius, though, isn't just in climbing out of personal hardship. It's in figuring out how to turn tribal feuds into unity. He builds a coalition not by demanding blind loyalty, but by redistributing plunder fairly, punishing betrayal swiftly, and making it clear that the Khan's tent is big enough for anyone willing to bleed for it. The Mongols had always known how to fight, but now they were learning how to fight together. That's a terrifying upgrade. You, standing nearby in this story, can almost feel the shift. Clans that once raided each other suddenly march side by side. Rivals who swore they'd never kneel find themselves convinced or crushed by Temujin's relentless drive. He's not just uniting people. He's teaching them to imagine something larger than their own herds. That idea, the empire before the empire, takes root. And then comes the declaration. Temujin is proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. It's not just a fancy title, it's a manifesto. From this moment, you're no longer just a nomad of the steppe. You're part of a machine with ambitions stretching far beyond the horizon. The same man who once scrounged for scraps now commands armies that will redefine maps. It's wild to think how quickly fortunes flip. One poisoned meal shatters a family, and a few decades later, the son of that family is holding the fate of empires in his hands. For you, it means the ground is starting to shake, not with earthquakes, but with the pounding of thousands of hooves. The steppe, once a patchwork of feuding tribes, is turning into something unified, disciplined, and unstoppable. And honestly, the rest of the world has no clue what's about to hit it. The empire is barely stitched together before you realize Genghis Khan's secret weapon isn't just horses or arrows, it's communication. Imagine running an empire that stretches from Korea to Persia with no smartphones, no Google Maps, not even a reliable postman. Most rulers of the time relied on messengers who trudged along slowly, losing letters in mud, or getting robbed by bandits. Genghis looks at that chaos and says, "Nope, we'll do better." And he does. He invents a pony-powered internet. It's called the Yam system, and it's basically a relay of postal stations stretching across the empire. At each station, a fresh horse and rested rider are ready. A courier gallops in, tosses the message, gulps down some curd or milk, and the next rider bolts off again. Repeat that every 25 miles, and suddenly you've got information flying across continents faster than anyone thought possible. Some messages could travel hundreds of miles a day. Try competing with that on a medieval donkey. Here's the mainstream fact. This communication network was so efficient that it inspired later systems, including postal relays in Europe. The Mongols, often stereotyped as mere destroyers, actually built one of the most advanced infrastructure projects of their age. Without it, holding together such a massive realm would have been impossible. And here's the quirky tidbit. Those relay stations weren't just for letters. They also doubled as medieval motels. A traveler with the right passport could stop in, swap horses, grab food, and crash in relative safety. Think of it as the steppe version of a chain hotel, minus the swimming pool, but with a lot more fermented milk. Historians still argue whether the system was primarily a tool for military control or whether it also sparked unexpected cultural exchange, since merchants and envoys often piggybacked on the network. Now picture yourself as a rider in this system. You're wrapped in furs, the wind slicing your face as you thunder across endless grasslands. Your job isn't glamorous. You're carrying scrolls, orders, maybe even a pouch of dried cheese, but you're the bloodstream of an empire. Miss a station, and someone's campaign might collapse. Deliver on time, and cities fall or trade booms. No pressure. What makes it all even more clever is how the Mongols integrated it with their espionage game. Scouts fan out like human drones, mapping routes, counting enemy forces, and reporting back for the postal lines. Genghis always seems to know more than his enemies, because he literally does. His intelligence system hums like a machine fueled by hooves. And let's not forget the psychological effect. When rumors spread that Mongol messengers could cover distances in days that took others weeks, it added to their almost supernatural reputation. Imagine being a king in Europe, hearing that a Khan thousands of miles away knows your troop movements before you've even finished writing the order. It feels like magic, but it's just logistics sharpened into a blade. Standing at one of these relay posts, you realize this is the real skeleton of the empire. Horses waiting, guards watching, riders eating hurried meals. It's not glamorous, but it's effective. The yurts and herds of your childhood have grown into a highway of speed, binding together lands that were never meant to connect. And you can't help but smirk. Somewhere in the future, empires will pour fortunes into telegraphs, trains, and internet cables. But here, in the middle of the steppe, the Mongols already cracked the code. Control the flow of information, and you control the world. If you think the Mongols just rode around shooting arrows, you're about to be pleasantly horrified. Picture this. You're galloping across the plain, bow in hand, when suddenly you see a city looming ahead. Massive stone walls, tall towers, smug defenders looking down like, good luck, nomads. In theory, this should be your kryptonite. Steppe warriors aren't supposed to take walled cities. But the Mongols? They shrug, whistle for their engineers, and roll out the medieval equivalent of a construction company armed with explosives. Here's the mainstream fact. The Mongols didn't invent siege warfare, but they perfected the art of borrowing. Everywhere they conquered, they scooped up the best talent. Chinese engineers, Persian masons, Arab mathematicians, and folded them into their war machine. If someone knew how to build catapults, trebuchets, or even early gunpowder devices, congratulations, you've just been recruited. Historians still argue whether this was a carefully planned strategy or just ruthless opportunism. But the result was the same. Walls that had stood for centuries suddenly crumbled. Imagine the scene. A city like Zhengdu, modern Beijing. Here's that the Mongols are outside. Instead of turning around in despair, the horsemen unpack siege towers, battering rams, and catapults that fling stones the size of oxen skulls. Some sources even mention them using early forms of explosive bombs, porcelain shells filled with gunpowder. Settled empires thought the nomads would starve outside the gates. Instead, they got a fireworks show. Now here's a quirky tidbit. The Mongols were apparently not above weaponizing disease. Chronicles claim they once catapulted plague-infected corpses over the walls of Kaffa, a Black Sea city. Was it deliberate biological warfare, or just very grim recycling? Historians still argue whether it sparked the later spread of the Black Death into Europe, but the fact that it's even on the table tells you how creative these warriors could be. And siege warfare wasn't just brute force, it was psychological theater. Sometimes the Mongols would take prisoners from nearby towns and march them ahead as human shields, forcing defenders to either kill their own neighbors or surrender. Other times, they'd promise mercy if the gates opened quickly. But if resistance dragged on, well, mercy was canceled like a bad TV show. Word got around fast, and many cities simply gave up without a fight, terrified of what might come after. Picture yourself in the middle of this operation. One moment you're herding goats, the next you're dragging logs to build a siege tower taller than the city walls. The air is thick with smoke from burning pitch, and the ground shakes each time a stone slams into masonry. You're still a steppe warrior at heart, but now you're wielding the weapons of civilizations you once envied. It's like downloading the DLC pack for Conquest. The humor, of course, is dark. Imagine some poor knight explaining, "Don't worry, these savages don't know how to handle walls." Then 5 minutes later, boom, his parapet collapses under a flying boulder and the savages are climbing in through the rubble. Surprise! What's astonishing is how quickly the Mongols adapt. Within a generation, they go from open grass battles to orchestrating sieges that rival anything in Europe or the Middle East. It's like teaching a wolf pack how to operate cranes and bulldozers, and then realizing they're better at it than you are. So, when you think of Mongols as just fast riders, remember the cities. Remember the walls that cracked, the towers that toppled, and the defenders who looked down one day and saw not just horsemen, but an entire mobile university of destruction. You've seen the Mongols crush walls with borrowed brilliance, but honestly, their deadliest weapon doesn't weigh a ton or roll on wheels. It's fear. Pure, calculated, cold-blooded psychology. Imagine being a city guard, peering out over your battlements, and hearing that the Mongols are on the way. You don't picture ponies, you picture annihilation. That's how they win half their battles before firing an arrow. Mainstream historians agree. The Mongols used terror as a deliberate strategy. They didn't just win wars, they staged them like horror shows. Entire towns that resisted too long were wiped out, their destruction broadcast like medieval social media. Survivors carried the story forward, trembling, warning the next city what happened to stubborn defenders. Suddenly, when a Mongol showed up, those gates creaked open a lot faster. But here's the quirky tidbit. They weren't always ruthless. Some towns surrendered peacefully and were left relatively intact, even rewarded with trade opportunities. The problem was, no one ever knew which version of the Mongols would show up. It was a bit like spinning a roulette wheel. Land on mercy, and you might get tax breaks. Land on wrath, and your city is toast. Historians still argue whether the reputation for total destruction was exaggerated propaganda or consistent practice. Either way, the uncertainty worked like a charm. Their battlefield tricks were equally unnerving. Picture this. You're facing a Mongol cavalry unit, and suddenly they turn and flee in panic. Victory, right? Wrong. You chase, only to find yourself lured into a trap where arrows rain down from every direction. This fake retreat tactic was so effective that it became a Mongol trademark. Opponents eventually learned to mistrust their own eyes, hesitating at the worst possible moment. Another layer of their psychological warfare was rumor spreading. Agents traveled ahead of armies, whispering exaggerated stories of Mongol invincibility. Tales of entire kingdoms flattened in days, of arrows blotting out the sun, of riders who never slept. Think of it as ancient propaganda, except instead of Twitter bots, It's merchants and prisoners carrying the bad news. By the time the Mongols actually arrived, many enemies were already mentally defeated. Standing in their ranks, you see how this plays out. Riders advance slowly, deliberately, banners flapping, drums pounding like thunder across the plain. The enemy watches, sweating, as memories of massacres ripple through their imagination. Maybe they'll fight, maybe they'll surrender, but the fear is already corroding their resolve. And of course, the humor in all this is morbid. Imagine being a European chronicler writing. The Mongols came, and the townsfolk all ran screaming before a single arrow was loosed. It's basically the medieval version of quitting the video game before the match even loads. There's also the bizarre detail of how the Mongols sometimes staged mock armies. They'd light multiple campfires or tie branches to horses' tails, whipping up clouds of dust to make their forces seem larger. It's intimidation through special effects. Hollywood before Hollywood existed. What strikes you, walking among them, is how calm they are about it all. Terror isn't a side effect, it's a policy. Genghis Khan understood that ruling a vast empire meant you couldn't fight every city to the last man. But if every city thought you might, suddenly doors opened without a single arrow loosed. Fear was free, renewable, and brutally effective. So, yes, the Mongols had horses, bows, and engineers, but their greatest siege weapon was lodged in their enemies' minds. The steppe taught them survival, but conquest taught them something even sharper. Dread spreads faster than armies. Here's a twist you might not expect. While warriors thunder across continents, some of the empire's most important moves are being made back at camp by women. On the steppe, women don't just sit in the shadows. They run the household, manage the herds, and, when necessary, step into politics with the kind of authority that makes rival chiefs sweat. Mainstream historians highlight the role of Genghis Khan's first wife, Borte. After she was kidnapped by rival tribes and then rescued, she didn't fade into the background. Instead, she became his closest advisor, shaping alliances and keeping the family power base steady. Later, when Genghis was off conquering, she handled domestic affairs with remarkable skill. Without her, the whole empire, part of the Mongol Empire, might have collapsed before it began. And she wasn't alone. Mongol women regularly managed trade, decided where to move camps, and even oversaw distribution of loot. Think about that. While knights in Europe were busy locking their wives in castles to embroider tapestries, Mongol women were negotiating tribute payments and arranging political marriages. Historians still argue whether this authority was born purely from necessity, with men always away fighting, or whether nomadic culture inherently valued women more than settled societies did. Either way, the results are undeniable. Women had voices that mattered. Here's a quirky tidbit. One of Genghis Khan's daughters, Alakai Beki, was appointed as governor of an entire region in northern China. Imagine being a Chinese nobleman, and suddenly your new boss is a steppe princess who grew up chasing goats. She ruled effectively, balancing Mongol demands with local administration. That kind of role for a woman would have been almost unthinkable in many contemporary cultures. You, sitting inside the smoky warmth of a gur, can see how it works. When the men ride off, life doesn't pause. The herds still need milking, children need raising, and rival clans need dealing with. Women handle it all. And when warriors return, battered but victorious, it's the women who re-knit the fabric of camp life, rebuilding, redistributing, and reminding everyone that stability is as important as conquest. Even succession politics involved women. Genghis's mother, Holon, once guided him and his brothers through years of poverty after his father's death. Later, as matriarch, she continued to influence clan alliances. Steppe gossip even claimed that when disagreements flared among Genghis's sons, their mothers and wives played just as large a role in decision-making as the Khan himself. Now, don't mistake this for equality in the modern sense. Women still faced limits. But compared to other medieval societies, the Mongols were shockingly progressive. For example, women could own property, demand divorces, and even ride in a battle if the situation called for it. Chronicles mention women drawing bows beside men, holding the line when camps were attacked. And of course, you have to chuckle at the sheer practicality. Imagine being a Mongol wife, seeing your husband storm off dramatically to war, and thinking, fine, I'll handle the livestock, the trade negotiations, the kids, and probably clean up your mess when you get back. Spoiler alert, she usually did. So while outsiders picture the Mongols as a stampede of faceless horsemen, the truth is more complex. Behind every thunderous charge are women steering the quieter, but equally vital, machinery of empire. They don't just hold the fort, they define the fort. It's a reminder that power doesn't always come from the sword. Sometimes it comes from the person making sure the stew is hot, the herds are safe, and the political chessboard stays balanced. Without women, the Mongol Empire would have been all gallop, no glue. You're probably expecting Mongol life to be nothing but horse sweat, bowstrings, and war cries. But when you peek inside their worldview, you discover a spiritual landscape that looks less like a battlefield and more like a religious buffet. The Mongols didn't just worship one way. They collected belief systems like they collected conquered cities. Shamans, Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, everyone seemed to have a seat at the fire, provided they didn't get too pushy. The baseline faith was shamanism. You can almost picture yourself standing on the steppe, wind snapping through your coat, as a shaman beats a drum to summon spirits of earth and sky. Spirits govern nature. Ancestors lingered to give advice, and offerings were tossed in a fire for luck. Genghis Khan himself reportedly visited sacred mountains, praying to the eternal blue sky before big campaigns. This sky god reverence wasn't just personal. It was woven into the political fabric, giving Khan's divine legitimacy. But here's where it gets quirky. The Mongols didn't enforce uniform worship. As their empire expanded, so did their religious roster. In China, you see Buddhist monks teaching Mongol princes. In Persia, Muslim scholars advising on governance. In Europe, Christians petitioning the Khans. Genghis and his successors often invited clerics of different faiths to debate each other, like a medieval version of a talk show panel. Historians still argue whether these debates were meant to find truth or just to keep religious leaders busy and not stirring up trouble. And the tolerance wasn't lip service. The Mongols exempted priests, monks, and imams from taxes and military service, so long as they prayed for the Khan's success. Imagine that. You're a priest in a besieged city, and instead of losing your head, you're suddenly asked to bless Mongol arrows. One fun tidbit, Genghis Khan's grandson, Monk, hosted a famous religious debate at his court where Buddhists, Christians, and Muslims all argued their case. It ended with no official winner, but plenty of wine being poured. Picture the scene. One monk says, "Our path is the truest." Another cleric shouts back, "No, ours is." Meanwhile, a Mongol noble interrupts to ask if someone could please refill his cup. For you, the atmosphere is surreal. You walk through a Mongol capital like Karakorum and see temples of different religions standing practically next door to each other. A Christian church, a Buddhist stupa, a mosque. It looks like a spiritual theme park. Even the great Khans themselves married wives of various faiths, ensuring a balance of influence at court. Yet tolerance didn't mean weakness. If a religion challenged the Khan's authority, things turned ugly fast. Some Muslim rebellions were crushed with brutal efficiency, and Buddhist monasteries that plotted against Mongol power got torched. But generally, the Khans played referee rather than executioner. The unspoken rule: pray as you like, but loyalty comes first. There's also a subtle irony here. While Europe was ripping itself apart with crusades and inquisitions, the barbaric Mongols were letting different religions coexist under one yurt-shaped umbrella. Historians still debate whether this policy was enlightened pluralism or just cold pragmatism, a way to keep diverse subjects pacified. Maybe both. And tucked into this cosmopolitan stew, you can't resist a little modern joke. If the Mongols had Yelp reviews for religions, they'd probably read shamanism, reliable, works on the go. Buddhism, great for inner peace, but supply your own tea. Christianity, pairs well with wine debates. Islam, strong legal system, excellent administrators. In the end, what mattered most wasn't which god you worshipped. It was whether you respected the Khan's law. The eternal blue sky was always above, but under it, the Mongols allowed 1,000 prayers to rise, each one adding to the empire's curious, multi-faith heartbeat. As the dust of conquest settles, you find yourself not staring at ruined cities, but at roads. Lots of them, strung together like veins across the continent. The Mongols didn't just conquer for glory. They opened highways of commerce that stretched from the Pacific shores of China all the way to the Mediterranean. Welcome to the revitalized Silk Roads, where silk isn't even the half of it. You ride along with caravans hauling not just luxury cloth, but paper, gunpowder, and spices. Silver pours westward, while glassware and textiles flow east. You might imagine Marco Polo jotting notes about Chinese coal or noodles while Persian merchants trade turquoise. It's almost like a medieval version of Amazon Prime, except with camels instead of delivery vans and an occasional risk of getting robbed by bandits. Luckily, under Mongol rule, those bandits didn't last long. The Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace, meant even a silk thread could cross thousands of miles with relative safety. Here's your mainstream fact. The Mongols established one of the safest overland trade environments in pre-modern history. Caravanserais, those fortified inns, popped up along major routes. Guards patrolled stretches of road, ensuring that goods made it from Kashgar to Samarkand, from Baghdad to Beijing. Imagine the relief of a merchant who previously risked death at every bend in the desert, now finding a well-lit rest stop with food, water, and maybe even a place to gossip about which Khan's wife had the fanciest jewelry. But here's a fringe tidbit. Mongol officials sometimes required merchants to wear identification tablets, little metal passports called paisi. These marked you as under Mongol protection, almost like flashing a VIP badge. Some of these tablets carried inscriptions that promised death to anyone who harmed the bearer. That's one heck of a "don't mess with me" sign. Historians still argue whether the Mongols actually increased trade volume dramatically or whether they simply stabilized what was already bubbling under the surface. Was it a golden age of exchange, or just a temporary lull in violence that gave merchants breathing room? Either way, you, trudging alongside camels, can sense how the sheer scale of movement transformed everything from cuisine to clothing. And you can't miss the cultural mashups. Chinese gunpowder recipes make their way west, reshaping warfare in Europe. Persian medicine seeps into China. Mongol couriers deliver information faster than gossip spreads in a modern group chat. Even foodstuffs travel. Noodles cross paths with Middle Eastern pasta, and suddenly dinner menus on both sides of the world are looking suspiciously familiar. Of course, there's a darker punchline. Along with silk and silver, pathogens traveled too. The Mongol trade highways became conduits for the bubonic plague. By the mid-14th century, that Black Death was hitting Europe like the world's worst delivery package, signed, sealed, and unknowingly shipped across the Silk Roads. You can almost imagine a merchant sneezing halfway between Samarkand and Crimea, and history never recovers. Still, the empire's emphasis on trade had lasting effects. Long after Mongol cavalry thundered off the scene, the commercial arteries they revived remained. Europeans like Columbus would later dream of reaching Asia, inspired by stories of riches that trickled along Mongol trade routes. In a roundabout way, the Mongols didn't just connect continents, they helped spark the age of exploration. And because humor is survival, you imagine yourself as a weary merchant reaching a Mongol outpost, sighing, "Finally, a safe stop," only to find the inn's menu is fermented mare's milk and boiled mutton yet again. Sure, your silks are intact, but your stomach? Not so lucky. In the end, you realize the Mongols weren't just riders who conquered. They were connectors who turned Eurasia into one vast network, for better and sometimes for worse. Every silk scarf, silver ingot, and spice sack you see is a reminder that empires may crumble, but trade find a way to endure. You followed caravans and horsemen across deserts, but sooner or later, someone has to keep order. That's when a Mongol law book, the famous Yasa, rides into the picture. You can almost hear it whispered around the campfire. A secret code, part rumor, part reality, equal parts scary and practical. And if you think your local parking tickets are strict, wait until you see what Genghis Khan thought about stealing horses. Spoiler, it's not just a fine. Here's the mainstream fact. The yasa was the legal framework credited to Genghis Khan, intended to bind his sprawling empire together under one set of rules. Whether you were a steppe herder, a Persian merchant, or a Chinese bureaucrat, you technically fell under its gaze. No stealing livestock, no lying, no betraying the Khan. Punishments were harsh. Execution was common. Exile less so. But that harshness served a purpose. In a world where betrayal could unravel a fragile empire, consistency was survival. Now for the quirky tidbit. One clause supposedly banned bathing in running water during summer. Why? Because shamans believed it offended the spirits of rivers. Imagine trying to stay fresh on a 2,000-mile march with that restriction. No wonder fermented mare's milk was so popular. It probably masked the smell. Historians still scratch their heads, though. Was this law enforced everywhere, or was it more like an overzealous "please don't feed the pigeons" sign in a city park? And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the yasa ever existed in full written form. Some say it was an oral code passed down through memory and adapted on the fly. Others suspect later Persian chroniclers exaggerated its reach, turning Genghis into a lawgiver to match Moses or Hammurabi. In other words, was the yasa a real rulebook, or just a myth designed to make subjects think twice before misbehaving? Still, for you trudging along in the 13th century, the laws are very real. You see merchants carrying Pisces passports, herders watching their herds with newfound security, and warriors terrified of breaking discipline. The yasa demanded obedience in military ranks. Desertion, theft, or cowardice often led to death. Imagine your commander announcing, "Anyone caught falling asleep on guard duty will face execution." Suddenly your midnight watch feels very different. But the law wasn't only about punishment, it was about fairness too. The Mongols outlawed aristocratic privilege in certain cases. A noble and a herder could face the same penalties for theft. That sense of equality, rare in the medieval world, helped Genghis maintain loyalty among diverse subjects. Ironically, the empire of one of history's most ruthless conquerors sometimes offered more legal fairness than Europe's feudal courts. You can almost picture yourself in a crowded Mongol camp, overhearing a case being judged. Two merchants argue over missing bolts of silk. The judge examines the evidence, hears both sides, and bam, a ruling is issued quickly, decisively, no 12-month wait for appeals. Justice here is swift, sometimes frighteningly so. Of course, the humor writes itself. Imagine being fined not for tax evasion, but because you washed your socks in the wrong stream. Or picture a Mongol officer solemnly explaining, "Sorry, sir, but the spirits of water are watching you." If medieval TikTok had existed, the yasa would have gone viral instantly. What lingers with you, though, is the tension, a code both strict and strangely flexible, terrifying and fair. You realize the empire wasn't stitched together by horses alone. It needed laws to keep thousands of tribes, towns, and tongues from flying apart. Even if half the rules were rumor, the belief in them was enough. And so you march on, under the shadow of the yasa, knowing that one slip could mean your neck, but also that it's the invisible glue keeping the whole Mongol machine intact. Your boots crunch through snow at the edge of Europe, and suddenly the Mongol tide feels less unstoppable than it did on the steppe. Expansion, you discover, isn't just about charging forward. It's about colliding with walls, armies, and sometimes even the weather itself. The Mongols swept through Khwarezm and into Russia with terrifying speed, but when they pushed into Hungary in 1241, the march began to wobble. You, caught in the middle of it all, watched them steamroll a European coalition at the Battle of Mohi, thousands of knights and peasants scattered like leaves before a storm. But just when victory seems total, the Great Khan dies, and the army pulls back. Imagine being a Hungarian survivor. We lost everything, but they just left? That's the mainstream fact. succession crises often forced Mongol armies to retreat from campaigns, not because they were losing, but because generals were legally bound to return and elect a new Khan. The empire's political machinery trumped battlefield momentum, leaving Europe to breathe a very nervous sigh of relief. Now for the quirky tidbit. In their invasion of Japan, the Mongols carried with them bundles of sulfur bombs, primitive grenades that burst with smoke and thunder. Samurai chroniclers later described iron pots that exploded like lightning, scattering fire. Sounds less like medieval warfare and more like someone brought illegal fireworks to a sword fight. Unfortunately for the Mongols, those bombs couldn't stop the typhoons that ripped through their fleet. Twice. If you've ever felt unlucky about missing the bus, picture losing half your navy to what the Japanese would call kamikaze, the divine wind. And here's the open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether it was the typhoons alone that doomed the invasions of Japan, or if Mongol logistical overreach and poor shipbuilding also played a bigger role. Did the gods save Japan, or did shoddy carpentry and overstretched supply lines sink the dream? Either way, you wouldn't want to be bailing water on one of those hastily built ships. In the Middle East, the Mongols toppled Baghdad in 1258, an event that sent shockwaves across the Islamic world. Libraries, canals, and scholars vanished in the onslaught, and yet you hear tales that some Mongol leaders later adopted Islam, blending conqueror with convert. But expansion wasn't always smooth. When they reached Mamluk Egypt in 1260, they were handed their first decisive defeat at the Battle of Ain Jalut. You stand on a dusty hill as the Mongol cavalry, for once, breaks against another steppe-trained foe. It's like watching two mirrors face each other. Both sides fast, disciplined, and ruthless, but the Mamluks had home turf, and apparently a better game plan that day. Still, you notice a pattern. The Mongols never really quit. When checked in one region, they simply turned their fury somewhere else. Beaten in Syria? Focus shifts to China. Repelled in Japan? Try Vietnam. Failed in Hungary? Consolidate Russia. It's like watching a relentless video game boss. You win one round, but the fight isn't over. And of course, the humor hides in the gaps. Picture terrified European monks writing that Mongols were spawn of the apocalypse, only for the invaders to pack up and leave because they had a leadership meeting back in Mongolia. Or imagine a samurai proudly explaining how his swordsmanship defeated the Mongols, while in reality, a typhoon just flipped their fleet like overturned sushi trays. Medieval bragging rights must have been wild. For you, the lesson stings. Empire isn't a straight march forward. Even the most terrifying cavalry in history has to stop for politics, weather, or the rare enemy who can match their speed. Expansion meets resistance, and resistance sometimes wins. You ride through the dust of a conquered town, and someone whispers the strangest statistic you'll ever hear. Nearly 1 in every 200 men alive today may trace their Y chromosome back to Genghis Khan. That's right. You might be distantly related to the guy who once turned half of Eurasia into his personal horse track. Historians still argue whether this staggering genetic footprint is the result of deliberate policies, sheer conquest, or just the fact that powerful men in nomadic societies often had dozens, sometimes hundreds of wives and concubines. Either way, it means the Mongol legacy isn't just castles toppled or trade routes built. It's literally walking around in people's DNA. Imagine introducing yourself at a party and realizing half the room could technically call you cousin. But let's back up to the mainstream fact. The empire fractured into 4 major khanates after Genghis's death: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. Each branch tried to keep the Mongol spirit alive, yet they adapted to local cultures. Persian art blossomed under Ilkhanate patronage, Chinese administration was reshaped under the Yuan, and Russia lived under Mongol tribute for centuries. You're seeing the empire morph like quicksilver, not vanishing, just reshaping into regional powerhouses. Now the quirky tidbit. In the Golden Horde, some Mongol rulers went so native they started building wooden palaces and adopting Russian Orthodox advisors. You'd half expect them to start debating icons in monasteries instead of planning raids on Poland. One Khan even issued coins with Arabic inscriptions on one side and Christian crosses on the other, an odd medieval version of trying to please everyone. Still, not all Mongol legacies are cozy. The empire's breakups spread bloodlines, but also rivalries. The Chagatai Khanate, for instance, became notorious for infighting, which historians still argue was either the natural decay of a steppe empire or proof that Genghis's descendants were too busy fighting over bragging rights. Picture Thanksgiving dinner with that family. Pass the mare's milk, and by the way, I deserve half of Central Asia. For you, trudging through this fractured landscape, it feels like déjà vu. The original unity under Genghis is gone, replaced with cousins squabbling over borders. Yet the bloodlines keep stretching into Persia, into Russia, into China, into Southeast Asia. The empire splinters politically, but biologically, it expands like wildfire. And this brings us to that scholarly debate. Did Genghis and his immediate heirs consciously establish a reproductive dynasty policy, marrying daughters into powerful clans and fathering heirs across territories to lock down loyalty? Or is the massive genetic legacy simply a byproduct of victory and the privileges of power? Historians still argue whether this was strategy or coincidence, but when you look at the numbers, it's hard not to wonder if someone had a long-term plan in mind. You, meanwhile, are left grinning at the irony. The Mongols may have lost control of their massive empire, but they won the longest game of all: family tree domination. Forget Netflix. Your ancestry test could be hiding the most epic spoiler reveal in history. Surprise, you're 0.5% Mongol. So when the empire starts fracturing, don't think of it as an ending. Think of it as the point where the thunder of hooves shifts from armies to lineages, where the true empire becomes invisible, living in culture, politics, religion, and in the very veins of people today. If immortality means leaving behind a piece of yourself in the world, Genghis may have pulled off the greatest immortality hack of all. The dust settles on the steppe, and you realize the thundering hooves have gone quiet. The Mongol Empire, once a firestorm racing across continents, has broken into fragments. Yet when you look closer, traces remain everywhere. In Russia, the memory of tribute to the Golden Horde lingers in its centralized state traditions. In China, the Yuan dynasty left marks on architecture, bureaucracy, and even cuisine, dumplings and noodles that bear a whisper of the steppe. In Persia, the Ilkhanate blended Mongol military grit with Persian artistry, commissioning illuminated manuscripts that glow to this day. The empire may have dissolved, but its fingerprints cover half the globe. Here's the mainstream fact. The Mongol Empire at its peak was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Korean peninsula all the way to Hungary. No empire before, or since, has matched its breadth on horseback. But here's the quirky tidbit. Genghis Khan himself was buried in an unmarked grave, location unknown. Legend has it that those who buried him killed anyone they met on the way, then rode horses over the site to erase all traces. To this day, historians still argue whether his tomb lies in Mongolia's Kenai Mountains, beneath the Onan River, or if it's deliberately lost forever. Imagine the most powerful man in history resting under a spot some goat probably grazes on. As you walk the final stretch of this story, you can't help but feel the paradox. The Mongols reshaped civilizations, yet their own homeland returned to quiet grasslands. The empire's physical borders vanished, but its cultural and genetic borders stretched into eternity. And you probably wouldn't have survived the ride. Remember, even seasoned warriors drop from exhaustion, but you've made it to the end of the march. So let's slow down together. Picture the steppe not filled with warriors, but with silence. The wind is soft, the grass ripples like an ocean, and the echoes of hooves become no louder than a heartbeat. The Mongols may no longer ride, but their presence hums in the background of history, like a faint drumbeat you hear only when the world grows still. This is the moment where the story exhales. You let go of sieges and battles, of terror and triumph, and you notice instead the resilience of memory. The empire's collapse wasn't a vanishing act. It was a transformation. It folded into nations, religions, languages, art, and yes, bloodlines that still shape our world. And now, as your own march ends, you realize that the secret of the Mongols' success wasn't just horses or arrows. It was adaptability. It was the way they took from others, engineers, artisans, administrators, and made something new. It was the way they lived light, moved fast, and thought bigger than their borders. That is why their shadow still stretches across time. So, take a breath. Let the grasslands fade to twilight. Somewhere, a herder pours fermented mare's milk, a child learns to ride, and a horse breaks into a gallop under the endless sky. The empire is gone, but its rhythm carries on, hidden in the weave of history's fabric. You're not listening to hoofbeats anymore. You're listening to a whisper, and that whisper will never quite go silent.